Welcome to the Freedom and Democracy Dialogues here at CEU. And those of you who've joined us from outside, always welcome. And of course, to all of our students and faculty, this is home. Let me just say a few words before turning everything over to much more qualified people who are seated to my left, to tell you a little bit about what it is we're trying to do, not only in this dialogue, but this is part of a series of dialogues that we've started. This one particularly interesting and important. It's on social networks and social media, the implications for democracy and civil society. I think we all know that ever since the invention of the wheel, technology has been a fascinating double-edged sword that can be used for, in the case of the wheel, transportation, or for instruments of war. In the case of communications technology, for the promotion, and certainly in the case of social media, for the promotion of civil society and democracy, but also as a potential instrument of authoritarian use. And so technology is not the issue here today. It's really about the use of technology, and it's a fascinating question. Background on these dialogues. These are a series of dialogues that I felt that it was important for us to have to host here at CEU this year, and probably will continue into the coming year or two, because we are, after all, a mission-driven university. CEU is an open society institution that promotes democracy and freedom, and it studies those very important topics. We, of course, were founded at a time of enormous change here in this region 20 years ago, where there were remarkable events that we all now can recite in our sleep, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the collapse of the Soviet Union and victory for democracy across Central and Eastern Europe, and actually, in some respects, far beyond. I always like to remind people that 20 years ago was also the great revolution in South Africa and the elimination of apartheid there, struggle for democracy continuing, and in parts of Central and South America, and certainly in parts of East Asia. We had very high hopes at that time for freedom and democracy. It was a time of extraordinary hope, and indeed some of those hopes, I suppose, were fulfilled. But I think this is a much more sober time that we're living in now, and it's a time for not only taking stock of what has happened, and there have been many things that have happened over these last 2 decades, but also taking stock happened in terms of the expansion of democracy and freedom, but taking stock of the challenges that are all around us for these very basic principles of open society. We certainly see a resurgence of authoritarianism in parts of the world, some of it even right here in Central Europe. We see a rise of new nationalism, fueled in some respects by the financial and economic crisis. We see a rise of xenophobia and a fear of the other. But we also see a remarkable group of and set of developments which continue to give us hope, even though we sometimes hope against hope, that there can be a continuing development of democracy, and nowhere more powerfully than in Egypt, where one of our panelists comes from tonight, and other parts of North Africa and the Middle East. It's a time when the new social media and the question of technology can be looked at very closely, as we can see what happened. The organizational structures of events in Tahrir Square and elsewhere may have occurred as a result of social media, but it's also a time when we can see across the internet new efforts to censor and develop a regulation of this new means of communication. So the role of our university should be to examine all of this, and that's what we will do in tonight's session. We will also do this in future sessions when we look at such issues as constitutionalism and basic principles of the rule of law, and other aspects of the struggle between democracy on the one hand and authoritarian and other developments on the other hand. Enough from me. You have much more interesting talks to hear from later on, but I'm very pleased to welcome, and I will only mention their names for further introductions later, our two experts, Evgeny Morozov, who of course is an internationally recognized expert on the internet from Belarus, and Ahmad Gharbeia, an Egyptian social media expert and blogger who is very active in Tahrir Square. But most of all, I want to introduce tonight's moderator, who is actually well known to many in the audience, and particularly well known to me, because I happen to be married to her, very happily so. So everything that I have ever learned, you think I'm going to say about anything, but I'll at least say about social media and the media, I've learned from my wife, Ellen Hume. Ellen is an Annenberg Fellow at the Center for Media and Communication Studies here at CEU.
I'm very excited about tonight's discussion. I hope you are too. We have very interesting guests. Evgeny Morozov is famous. Many of you already know his work, have read his work, as a digital curmudgeon. He's a cyber skeptic, proudly so, I think, raising concerns about the internet and other new communication and social networking tools, because he thinks that despite the hype about their democratizing qualities, ultimately they may be undermining freedom and open societies. His new book, The Net Delusion, criticizes the West for too easily crediting new information flows, for the downfall of the Soviet bloc, even old information flows, I should say, and for utopian visions of how social networking and information flows promote open societies. Evgeny has many pedigrees. He's a contributing editor to Foreign Policy and the Boston Review. He's a Schwartz Fellow at the New America Foundation. He's currently a visiting scholar at Stanford University. He was a fellow at Georgetown University and at the Open Society Institute in New York, where he remains on the board of the OSI, or OSF now, information program. Before moving to the United States, Morozov was director of new media at Transitions Online, a Prague-based media development NGO active in 29 countries of the former Soviet bloc. So we're glad to have you, Evgeny.
Thank you.
Ahmad Gharbeia is an Egyptian cyber warrior. He was one of the earliest bloggers to populate the Egyptian blogosphere. He has a BA in Business Administration from Sadat Academy's Faculty of Management, and he has a Master's in Business Information Technology from Middlesex University. He's trained bloggers how to publish information securely and anonymously. He was editor of the Arabic edition of the Tactical Technology Collective's Security in a Box Arabic edition. Ahmad, who once dreamed of being an astronaut, is currently, yes, that's on your website, I'm sorry. Watch out what you post, watch out what you post. Is currently part of the ongoing Tahrir Square revolution in Egypt. He can tell us firsthand how these new communication weapons are being used in the changes that are still unfolding in his country, and what his hopes and concerns are for their role in the future. And now a word about the format. We will hear from each of our guest speakers for about 15 minutes each. And then each one will have a chance to react to the other for about 5 minutes, if they wish to. There's no obligation. And theoretically, that will leave 30 to 40 minutes for you. And we really enjoy having this be an open discussion. But I do have a rule, which is unusual for CEU. Each questioner or commenter gets one question or one comment. Not I have 3 questions, blah, 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 but one. Okay? So that's the rule. That's so we can get maximum participation, which after all is one of the goals of the new media landscape. So we thought we would start with Ahmad.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
Of course.
You're going to give us some special thing
Sure,
here?
but before I do, I'll just, speaking of what you just mentioned, I will give you a tip for the moderation that
Can you be heard?
it's a trick that we borrowed from the cyber world and brought to forums and discussions like these. We call it tweet nadwas, literally meaning a tweet forum. We invite people to attend in a discussion where the panel speaks for a while, and then everyone gets exactly 140 seconds to say whatever they want.
Wow.
And then the mic is taken from them whether they like it or not.
Oh, my. You're going to
So-
be a tough moderator in your day, aren't you?
Well, it's just
Well,
something
I want
that
to pose a question to you. Are you ready to go
Yeah,
here?
I'm ready.
My question is, are the new mobile and internet communication tools fundamentally, in your view, technologies of freedom, as Athil de Pool once said? And if so, in what specific ways are the local versions of Twitter, Facebook, or even the international versions, websites and mobile phone networks being used in Egypt to replace the old power structure and build a better society? Take it away.
All right, but I think during the discussion we're going to tweak and bend and twist this question, and hopefully we should get some sort of an answer. But before we do, I have an assortment of images and videos just to give you a visual of the environment in which activists live and work in Egypt.
Do you want to go to the side?
I'll go very quickly, telling you what comes to my mind about each of the slides, and then please ask me questions and push me if you need to. Before the social media that we know right now, and which is in the mind of most of us is Facebook and Twitter, there was still the internet, which in itself is a forum and a social medium where people interact, work, and correspond in various ways. In Egypt, the beginnings of a cyber society started around 2005. At that time, the political scene was a little bit getting into action. Things were being shaken. People were demonstrating in the streets of cities in Egypt, calling for the demise of Hosni Mubarak for the first time in a long time. There were presidential elections for the first time, and they were soonly followed by parliamentary elections that were a little bit different in their outcomes and their processions. And during this period, a very vibrant online society of young people, mostly educated, mostly depressed, and having seen and known that there are better things than what they have in Egypt. They began a conversation, which I like to call the Great Conversation, because for the first time in a long time, people were able to discuss issues and subjects that they had no space to discuss elsewhere. And this was one of the reasons why our cyberspace was very vibrant. So a core of activists that was among the first wave of those bloggers happened to be concerned about liberties, freedoms, human rights, good governance, arts, music, cinema, films, and they reflected all of that on the blogs. And while doing this, they became entangled in politics, not in a sense that they didn't want to, but because every path of social criticism eventually leads to politics. So a series of campaigns and events led to the growing and expansion of this community of activists, and the joining of newcomers constantly in it, not only in the cyberspace, but also in the streets, where a core of very few people were organizing a series of events. For example, in 2005, that was a very strange phenomena for Egyptian society and politics. A media professor in a university in Egypt very confidently described the kind of campaigning and rallying and protesting that they managed to do as the work of professional United States political campaigning companies, when they were just a bunch of people in their 20s doing all the work, creating banners for campaigns, setting demands for those campaigns, slogans and clear messages to be relayed in the cyberspace and in the street when they got together by the tens, sometimes by the fewer than tens, and surrounded by armies of central security soldiers in their full gear. It was very different from what will happen years from that date. The campaigns were very various. Some of them were in solidarity of detainees. Others were for social causes, for anti-torture, for the reformation of judiciary, which was a very important action in 2006, and which I myself camped in Tahrir for the first time in that year and for that cause. Then came Facebook, the social medium that most of us know and describe as the core of activity right now. This page, Khalid Saeed page. Khalid Saeed is a young Egyptian man who died, was murdered because of abuse at the hands of the police, which is something that happened and still happens very regularly in Egypt, unfortunately. But the reason why Khalid Saeed became an icon is that it was very difficult, even though the government tried to demonize him as a drug dealer or a person who maybe in the discourse of some people deserves to be roughed by the police. They couldn't manage to do this, and this page on Facebook created by a person who felt sympathetic with the cause and felt that he shouldn't be silent about it, managed to mobilize a new wave and people who have taken to the streets for the first time to express their worries about their society and the kind of government they have and the kind of treatment they face on the hands of officials in general, not only police. In the eve of the 24th of January, which was as most of you probably know, the eve of the series of protests and confrontations that eventually led to the demise of Hosni Mubarak and his government, the number of participants or the people who subscribed to this page on Facebook was 800,000, which is unprecedented number as far as I can remember anywhere, not only in Egypt, anywhere on social media, on Facebook, for a non-rock band. So this was significant, and when Khalid Saeed's page adopted the call for the 25th of January, calling for people to go in the streets and protest for the change of their lives, we knew that it was going to be different. We didn't know anything, of course, of the outcomes that would later develop, but the sheer number of people who were willing, and because we have seen in previous close by events that new people, new faces have been taking to the streets, unlike the usual suspects who go in every protest and march. This was very enlightening and very insightful for many of us. The medium became a popular medium. If you search in YouTube for any cause or idea in your mind, you'll find millions of videos that are produced by people who don't claim to be computer experts, nor artists, nor anything, just ordinary people expressing themselves and creating content, creations that tell about them and what worries them. The message of the 25th of January spread in new groups and classes of people that are not, as I was saying, the usual suspects. So this is what made it very popular. Social media was also, at least for a day, before it was completely shut down, Twitter was used as the command and control for the protesters on the 25th of January, navigating the streets of Cairo, which is a huge city of more than 25 million people, and which has a huge number of security forces in plain clothes and in riot uniform and gear, is something that we've been experimenting with for a long time. But having the ability to stay in touch with all the other groups, or most of the other groups, or the activists who are leading those groups or acting as communications officers for them, made a huge difference on that day. messages were being relayed about where each group is, the numbers, the formations of the people, the kind of support or otherwise of the population, of the police forces. And I guess the government learned very quickly the threat that it was facing using this simple technology that's available in the hands of many people in their mobiles. I don't, but so many people do. So during the next days, a succession or a series of events, a series of events eventually led to the complete shutdown of the internet, starting with the temporary blocking of, we'll come to this later, I'm trying to go back. Starting with the temporary blocking of Facebook and Twitter, and then this was the 25th of January. The young people calling for the first time for the complete dissolution and demise of the regime, rather than any specific reformations or changes in government. This was a very important and dramatic moment for everyone who was there. This is the presentation of the social network of Twitter. The circles are people, the colors are languages, and the size represents the formula that the producer of this graph used to signify influence in the network, using many determinants and factors in his interpretation. Recognizing the importance of this network, by the way, that network involves most of the active people that you can follow today to know what's going on the political scene in Egypt. Those people are journalists, bloggers. They come from every walk of life: doctors, teachers, ICT people, students. And together they create this space where information flows and is shared and replicated in an uncentralized way that is very difficult to stop unless you truly unplug the network, which is very expensive and very difficult to make. But we're grateful it happened, because if it hadn't happened before, I mean, if the network was not unplugged in many people's opinions, things would have been different. Maybe Hosni Mubarak would have been still in power, because when people had no other means to know what was going on, they took to the streets. And what started with a temporary blocking of Twitter and Facebook then became, it's unreadable, I'm sorry, then became a disruption of the mobile phone service, first SMS messages, then even voice calls, on the evening or dawn of the 28th of January. And this caused much more people than the usual people to go in the streets, parents wanting to know about the whereabouts of their children, regular people who were just furious because this hasn't happened in Egypt before. Before this, we didn't even have censorship on the internet, unlike many other neighboring countries, Arab countries, Tunis, Syria, Iran. So the complete shutdown was really a mistake that the government did, and we are glad that they did. So yeah, they did lots of mistakes, actually. They even stopped public transportation, trains and buses. People were actually marching, walking from surrounding cities around Alexandria and Cairo to get to the squares, and they were being stopped. And when you do this, you know that it's very difficult for you to remain in power. So starting on the 28th, we were completely without internet. From that time, we were depending on the word of mouth, on getting appointments right, because if you don't go in time, you will not meet the person. It's back in the olden days again. And what do you think the technology that we used in Tahrir was like on that day. Mobile phones were cut. Yes, they were shut down. We had no mobile phones. Even landlines in several places were suffering in areas of concentration of populations. It was catapults. This is from what the media likes to call the Battle of the Camel. I saw a couple of these being built in Tahrir to defend the square against the offenders. And they didn't work, but it was a good shot, a good try. I mean, we seem to have lost the old technology. So technology can also get lost and replaced by there is not enough books on the shelves, and there's no space for everything in your mind. So this is the kind of technology that was in Tahrir Square on that time. Nothing else. And this is how it looked like. And you can see my tent here. It's the blue one up on the right. It was one among the first. But this is how Tahrir Square looked like on the evening of February 11th, which is the day Hosni Mubarak left power or was forced to leave power. No one knows exactly. What followed from that moment on, and actually not only since the 11th of February, even since the first day the army were in the streets, the 28th of January, when the army took to the streets and we saw tanks for the first time in Cairo since 87. Military trials became the new threat. Before that time, we didn't even know the army existed. All my generation's memory or idea about the army is that it's the army that won the October War, got our land back, and it's a very esteemed organization in the minds of Egyptians. Until this time, we're suffering with lots of people just to tell them that, or convince them, or argue with them that even the army cannot manage a country. Only a civic society, a civil organization, a civil government can. So, military trials have 12,000 people have been subjected to military trials since January, some of whom are famous, who got more share of campaigning than others, because they had the right company, they found the right campaigners for them. They came from, it's also a class-based thing. If you're really poor and you know no one and you can't talk to the press, or you don't know the right people, or don't know how to reach human rights organizations, you are completely forgotten in jail. You can get a sentence and no one will hear about you, and 5 years later maybe. But because we had so many new blood in the revolution, this group, it's called Against Military Trials for Civilians, was formed, and it has been organizing the efforts of lawyers and visiting families and campaigning in media to make the cause of these people alive and not forgotten. This guy down here, I will tell you more about him later. Ala, he's my friend. He only got detained by the army a week ago, but I'll leave this for later. The army were not only detaining people and subjecting them to military trials, they were also making all kinds of mistakes that a conservative, hierarchical, unprogressive underorganization can make. They are shutting down TV channels on air under point of the gun. They are confiscating printed press. They are directly intimidating activists by summoning them to military interrogation, prosecution. But the worst so far was on the 40 days ago from now, near the public television building, where peaceful demonstrators, mostly Copts, were rallying to express their anger about the continuous attacks on on churches and on them as communities in various places in Egypt that has also been mishandled, not only in the past few months, but historically for tens of years. The army got into armed confrontation with the people, and 28 people were killed on that day by gunfire, and also by being run over by tanks. And while this was happening, state TV was inciting sectarian violence by claiming that Copts are attacking the very respected institution of the army, which can become really ugly very quickly, and a mistake that shouldn't take place. Oh, right. Activists' response was to immediately take back to the streets, organize marches, make a counter press conference to refute what the army were claiming in their press conference. You can also read statements about it by Human Rights Watch. And what the activists did, like they always have, is to act independently of the media and publish their own material, publish their own videos, their own testimonials that they have collected, their own photographs, and circulate them. And in fact, force media organizations that still had enough spine or independence or courage to relay these news, sometimes while distancing themselves from them, but eventually they had to, because when so many people are doing this, you cannot simply ignore it. This has also been a distinctive mark of social media in Egypt since its beginning, that it made the news and it forced traditional media to also take it. So as I was saying, they published their own videos, which have been against or counter to what the army have been claiming. The social media also was immediately filled with works of art and self-expression. The building here is the state TV building, and the angry panda says boycott. And the eagle, the bird, is the symbol of the state and the army at the same time. And it's standing on the corpse of a person, and the sign at the end. And it's very significant because these events took place right down the windows of state TV, yet state TV was unable to even get their cameras out the window and record what was going on. And at the same moment, the army were attacking other independent channels and forcing them to go off air. People also came to the aid of traditional media when they were unable to go against the regime, whatever it is, not only now but also since before, because of their complicated relationship with whatever regime there is. Sometimes they are unable to go against it. So what activists do is that they take whatever is confiscated and they republish it. A current campaign, as an example of what people do, and I'll just tell you give you a quick example, is when Alaa was accused of stealing weapons and driving tanks and throwing stones at the protesters and the army at the same time to incite the incident that happened there. He was jailed, and because he is a hardcore activist, he refused even to answer the questions of the military interrogator. He refused to recognize their legitimacy, which is the strongest message so far they got in regard to the military trials. And people's reactions, activists' reactions, and people in solidarity with Alaa immediately all turned into versions of him, replicating his avatar in different colors to say that one goes, there are thousands more. And it was very impressive for me. I mean, the quick and the savviness with which activists do this is impressive, actually. They come up with ideas that are truly grasping to the eye and mind, and then you can concentrate on the cause later, after you've been won by the first glance. And in the same regard as this campaign, this is being organized tomorrow in different places around the world, and Reem and I intend to organize a stand here somewhere in Budapest, so if you're interested, come talk to us afterwards about that. And you can read more about the details of that on their website, miltrials.com, or read the UN statement about it and the Guardian articles that were published, or follow the Twitter hashtag #NoMilTrials. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that Ahmad told me earlier today was that as they go forward in the effort to create a better society, they're hoping that some of the affordances of the distributed networks that they've been using to communicate will also be built into the governance and policy-making structures. And this is a very idealistic and interesting idea that you're going to create a new society, not just with the old hierarchy of top-down, but with these distributed networks, perhaps crowdsourced government services. Now, this is the kind of thing that really sets off Evgeny. So despite Ahmad's arguments about the liberating qualities of these tools in Egypt, and I know you acknowledge that they've been useful in Egypt, no one is arguing that that's not the case, but you're worried about the future of freedom of expression both on the net and because of the net. At least that's what your book seems to say. And could you please tell us about some of your concerns, both in the affordances of these technologies themselves, the ease of surveillance and targeting propaganda, and also concerns about the architecture of the internet itself, as Silicon Valley, Washington, Beijing, Tehran all take a hand in designing the communications landscape?
Sure. Well, I'll start, I think, by quickly responding to the issue raised with this new innovative solutions that the Egyptians can introduce into their government with the help of new media and crowdsourcing and databases and whatnot. In theory, there is nothing bad about it, and I think it's actually would be useful to try and see how it might work in a country, say, that is free of any strife and is not in the middle of political transition and is not susceptible to turmoil. You know, let's pick a country, if there are any, that don't have any of those problems and see if it works. And then I think it would be nice to see how it may work out in Egypt once it solves all of the issues that it currently has on its plate. I think otherwise, it's a bit of a luxury to start crowdsourcing the government, start experimenting with new decentralized models of governance in a country that is essentially in the middle of a huge political crisis. That's my only criticism of that model. With regards to everything else, I think what I took from Ahmad's presentation today is that the internet and new media can be useful at two stages. And those stages are the general mobilization and lead up that might lead to a revolution, and that may take years, if not decades. It's influencing the quality of debates that are happening in the public sphere. It's influencing the kind of ideas that are being floated outside of the government sphere. And all of that, I think, is well set and cogent. And the other point that he was making, I think, about the use and importance of new media was its immediate contribution to the revolution itself. What happens once the protests go underway, and the ways in which social media, mobile phones, and technology in general can be useful once protests begin unfolding. And my criticism applies, I wouldn't say that it applies to the Egyptian case. What I'm trying to do is to show some of the pitfalls that if the political situation were different, that the activists who take these statements at face value may run into. So just to give you a few examples. So it's not the first time, of course, that we saw the internet and new media play some role in both the public sphere of a country and also in a revolution. I'll start with the later one. I mean, we all remember the example from Iran from 2009, right? Where, again, there was a huge outcry in the Western media about the role that Twitter and internet have played. And in my own work, I argued that that role was overstated by Western media, but that's not something we need to examine today. But there is a general point that the internet was used. Maybe not Facebook, maybe not Twitter, but there were a lot of forums that were used. Flickr was used to upload photos. All of that was definitely happening. The problem with this use, however, is that since the protests did not succeed, what the government began doing in the aftermath of the protests was actually going to sites like Flickr or Facebook or Twitter or others and collecting evidence against the protesters. They were collecting photos. Some of those photos were published on government-run websites, and the government asked its loyalists to identify the people it didn't recognize or couldn't recognize in the pictures. It started tracing mobile calls. It started tracing internet traffic. It had a pretty good picture of who was talking to whom and doing what, and it used all of that information very skillfully in the 18 months or 12 or 24 months that followed to arrest most of the people who were opposing it. Similar example comes from Belarus, where during the elections of last December, there are rumors that the government actually turned to the operators of mobile networks and asked them for information of any of their subscribers who happened to be in the public square where the protests were happening on the day of the protests. And mobile networks have this data because subscribers use mobile phones that have to connect to towers, and you can actually pin down where the subscribers are. So again, it shows you the power of the government to actually learn where people are and thus have a list and go and intimidate people. So this is just that's just so that we don't forget that these tools, while they excel at spreading information in a very cheap and decentralized manner, also have some costs, which, of course, if the revolutionaries win, don't really matter. If they lose, they matter quite significantly. So what we want to do in the future is probably think about ways in which to minimize dangers associated with privacy when using such tools, and to maximize their potential to reach the maximum amount of people, number of people, without necessarily having to negotiate with the team that runs Google or Facebook, which again is also a big factor in much of this digital activism because they own the infrastructure that makes this activism possible. And very often activists run into problems, and I'm sure if you had more time, you would have told us how even the Facebook group you were talking about of Khalid Said actually was deleted from Facebook, suspended from Facebook temporarily because they didn't have an administrator with a real name, right? So, I mean, there are all sorts of hurdles that activists need to jump through to make those tools and platforms deliver, and we need to have a good inventory of those hurdles to make sure that those tools deliver in the future. That said, I also think we need to think a little bit more critically about the importance of the internet as a builder of this new public sphere that is the second part of the argument I've been making. While I generally agree that the internet has opened up many new spaces for debate and has given many new people who would not otherwise be participating in national debates space and attention, I think there are countries that have, authoritarian countries especially, that have managed to live quite comfortably with this new emerging public sphere. And here I'm talking primarily about Russia and China. Probably increasingly so also is the case with Iran, where we see that these governments have not only accepted their new blogging communities as inevitable, they have actively tried to manipulate the formation of public opinion on those platforms by hiring and training bloggers and commentators who would go and spread government ideology, by establishing full control over the platforms where such information is published, and thus making sure that some of the private companies might be able to delete content that the government wouldn't like, by orchestrating all sorts of cyber harassment and cyber attack campaigns on publishers and bloggers, making their lives harder, but without necessarily triggering any of the common censorship concerns from the West. There are all sorts of ways in which governments have found ways to control that blogosphere and control that new public sphere and use it to their own advantage. Now, and we also don't have to forget that the governments actually, and again, I'm talking mostly about Russia and China, find some of the discussions happening in the blogosphere quite useful, in part because it allows them to learn about what's happening in their own backyard. Many of them have no clue what's happening in the provinces, and having a lot of people complain in advance of any public protest is actually a good idea to preempt any public criticism or any public action. So they do invest more and more money into data mining solutions that allow them to identify trends, sentiment trends, especially what people are thinking and feeling, how they're feeling about certain issues, and use that information in manipulating the rest of their media institutions or exerting control over particular local governors and politicians. So all of that also has to be factored in into our analysis. The reason why I think the Egyptian state and the Egyptian government has been at a loss in dealing with these issues is they didn't engage with the internet seriously. Again, comparing the experience of, say, the Russian or the Chinese governments online and comparing the experience of the Egyptian government, I think that the Russians or Chinese were light years ahead of what was happening in Egypt in terms, not just in terms of censorship, of which there was not much in Egypt. There was not direct internet filtering, as far as I'm aware, in Egypt. Which there is in China, but there isn't in Russia, but also in terms of trying to cultivate smart people inside the regime who get these platforms. In Russia, you have plenty of consultants who are extremely smart about the internet, consulting Kremlin on what to do. Same goes for China. You have domestic internet companies controlling much of the online conversations. This is also key. If, say, similar protest breaks out in China, the Chinese Politburo has many better ways to reach out to people running their domestic internet platforms and ask them to remove content, to remove any mention of the Jasmine Revolution or whatever else, in part because these platforms are run by Chinese businessmen with huge domestic interest in China. This was not the case with Facebook in Egypt, where I doubt that Hosni Mubarak could have called Mark Zuckerberg and pressure him to delete anything from his website, right? So we also have to examine how, if you will, political economy of the web and who owns which resources ends up constraining or enabling certain kinds and types of debate happening online. I think it would be premature to expect similar outcomes that we saw in Egypt or Tunisia from Russian or Chinese websites because, again, they have a very spotty track record when it comes to hosting controversial content that the government may not like. That Khalid Said group you showed us from Facebook, that was set up, was it in June or in August of 2010?
The same year either.
So essentially it stayed online for more than 6 months and managed to attract 800,000 members, right? If you think about group, I'll give you an example. So in Belarus, there were huge protests, as you may know, earlier this year to protest the elections, but also the huge number of political prisoners. Some of those people, again, took to a popular social networking site, which is a Russian site called Kontakte. That group attracted about 300,000 members, which seemed very impressive and very sizable. But the moment the government found out, and the moment the government started perceiving it as a threat, the group mysteriously disappeared from the Russian social networking site, right? So essentially all the social capital and all the effort that went into building it over the course of 3 or 5 or 6 months was good for nothing because with a touch of a button, some system administrator in a Russian social networking company removed it, right? So again, there are ways and things that we need to consider before drawing excessively optimistic conclusions. The other way I would like to say is that even the nature of the digital public sphere deserves further critical study. I don't think it's the case that it favors only opinions that somehow incite people to go into the streets and protest. And I'm thinking particularly about that video, again from Iran, of that young woman who was shot, Neda, and that video was circulated very widely on the internet. There are quite a few people in Iran who actually think that the fact that this video was circulating on the Iranian internet resulted in many more Iranians deciding not to take risks and stay home and not to risk their lives because they saw what potentially might happen. Again, I think a lot here depends on the existing state of debate, on the existing sentiment towards the government, on the expectations of people towards the government, and on their own thinking and considerations. And all of that, of course, differs from country to country. But I think we should also expect that many of these networks will be manipulated quite skillfully by actors close to the government or by governments themselves to more or less spread fear and intimidate people who may otherwise choose to participate in one way or another. That we haven't seen that in Egypt, as I've said, again, maybe a reflection of their rather poor management of the internet, both as a resource but also as a platform for political conversation. By the way, I'm not aware of any well-organized efforts on the scale that we see them in China or Russia to, say, train and manipulate the blogosphere by, paying bloggers to go online, promote certain ideas. Nor do I know of any well-respected figures on the Arab internet who essentially consult the government on issues of social media. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of telecommunication guys, but guys who get Web 2.0, I just don't see them, and I don't spend much time in the Middle East, so correct me, but I do see a lot of them actually essentially working for the state in places like China or Russia. And that, of course, gives the state a huge intellectual advantage. The other point, and maybe the last point I would like to make here, is that when, Ellen, you asked me and introduced me, you said that my position is that I say that ultimately these tools and technologies may be repressive rather than liberating. And I think we have to be very careful here, because I actually reject any talk of ultimately or essentially or fundamentally. In part because I think it's not helpful, and it also very often beclouds our thinking about these technologies. If I look at the technology, say, like facial recognition, to me it's quite obvious, or deep packet inspection for that matter, or technology of self-surveillance, to me it's quite obvious that these technologies, all things being equal, will probably benefit the government more than the dissidents. In part because of what they do, in their essence, they tend to favor those who already have power or who want to control somebody, and that happens to be the government. There are many other technologies. Again, blogging and spreading information would probably, all things being equal, if you want to challenge an existing ideology or existing discourse, it will probably favor the challenger because the costs are low and there are many outlets in which to publish it. What I don't want to do is to try to come up with two columns, in which we state all the positive technologies, and then we state all the negative technologies, and then we add up what we have in each column, and then we try to compare and come up with an answer. That the internet is good or the internet is bad, and then we use that answer to go and reevaluate what was in each column, because we think that as long as the internet and technology is good for democratization, it doesn't matter that we have facial recognition technology, or it doesn't matter that we have deep packet inspection. I think this is very dangerous thinking. I'm not saying that you exercise that. I'm just saying that we have to be very careful in trying to ascribe some essential qualities to technology with a capital T. And this is where we really get into trouble. What needs to happen in the next 5 or 10 years is for us to start, personally, I would actually impose a moratorium on using the term internet. Because I think at this point, this term confuses more than it helps. Because we not only use it to describe a technical network, a collection of cables or DNS settings or URLs, we use it as a cultural term to more or less describe modern technology. Not just technologies, but also practices like social networking or chatting, the space that is occupied by companies in Silicon Valley. We use it to describe all sorts of things. And I just don't think it's helpful, in part because we tend to think that as long as the internet is good or liberating, we don't have to work hard to limit the kind of influence that Facebook has on the internet, or to work to solve issues like facial recognition or deep packet inspection. So what I would propose is that we actually start engaging with each of these technologies individually and try to get away from this bigger narrative about whether technology is good or bad. Believe me, there are no questions that you as future or current regulators will need to solve that ultimately go back to this question of whether technology is good, bad, neutral, or neutral. We do have plenty of questions to solve about the role of Western technologies in selling spyware and selling surveillance technologies to many of these regimes. We do have plenty of questions to solve with regards to privacy. We do have plenty of questions to solve with regards to the business business motives of Silicon Valley and where they want to take the web. All of these questions need to be solved. I just think we have to be very careful not to fall into this cultural debate that has been raging on, I can assure you, for several centuries, about technology with a capital T, and by that I also mean the internet with a capital I. I think I'll end here.
Very
we
nice.
can jump.
Wonderful. So, Ahmad, would you like to respond to anything that was said by Evgeny?
Yeah, just a few things. And in general, I agree with most of what Evgeny was saying. I'm also for a less concentration of power in any node in the internet. The internet was originally designed to be an uncentralized network without a single point of failure, without also a single point that can be suffocated and stop the operation of the whole network. So this applies to the technology side and to the human side, the powers, the owners, the money, the societies that work on top of it. So the more decentralization we can achieve, the better for everyone. It's not only governments who are trying to corner and get their grip back on the internet, including, by governments, I don't only mean third world governments or China or Iran or Egypt or Tunis or Syria. The United States government is trying to create all means of controls on the internet to guarantee, and I'm sure you know a lot about that, to guarantee that in the right time it can control the flow of information. What I'm opposing, or what am I more convinced that is a different matter, is that the flow of information itself is something that can never be condemned as bad or as destructive, because it's not the flow of information, but rather how people are using it, or how organizations and governments are using it. So again, as you were saying, it's not the technology as a capital T or a noun, or the flows of information, but what people are using with these. I'd like also to go back to very few points of what you were mentioning about privacy and anonymity. I have happened to be training activists in the Arab world and in some other places on the techniques and tools of blogging and publishing anonymously, and evading tracking and eavesdropping and circumventing censorship. But all the time, I like to remind people, activists and lawyers and journalists, that social and democratic change and political action requires real people. So while they were, I strongly encouraged them to master the tools, at the same time I strongly discouraged them from going underground. This again is something that I like to say. I cannot claim that it works everywhere all the time, because the mode of suppression is also an important determinant to how things happen. In Egypt, for example, we had no censorship in the internet, but also we hadn't had disappearances, like someone disappears without a trace, like what is common in Syria, for example. So the mode of operation and the mode of oppression by the government is different, and so are the activism that takes place there. Regarding also a government's advisor on technology, this is somewhat complicated in Egypt. Back when the internet was introduced, there was this group of technocrats who convinced, who themselves love the internet, love communications, love openness, who convinced the government that it's going to be good for business, for the economy, for new ways to maybe create a new medium, to do whatever the government likes to do, relay messages or whatever. And along the years, we have witnessed glimpses of what seems to be opposing wills among the government, which is not a solid black box, but rather is composed of parts and particles, including these technocrats who were seemingly opposing the government's constant attempt to get more control on the internet. We've seen, for example, how mobile phones were at one point sold without any form of registration. Then the registration became obligatory. then Wi-Fi, which was present everywhere in cafes and public places and clubs and all the public spaces, gradually started to require registration and association with mobile numbers. This process of control that the government was constantly trying to impose was not always one-directional. Businesses saw that maybe registration will reduce the number of people who were using their mobiles. It's common for in Egypt for people to have several lines on several companies. And when you enforce registration, you obviously reduce or increase the barrier for consuming the service. Restaurants had a good selling point when you could just sit down and use the internet for free without registration. So obviously there are balances that took a while for these effects to happen. So there are advisors, technological advisors on both sides of the equation, on the government side, on the business side, on the activist side, and they're all providing their opinions and trying to find good reason for things to happen or not happen. That's all I have in mind. Yeah.
I think I'll forgo my 5 minutes so that we have more questions.
Bravo. Wonderful. Okay, we're ready to open it up to you. I'm not sure I'm going to hold you to the 140 seconds rule, but I do think that one question or comment per person on the brief side, and frankly, the responses can be brief as well. All right? So who would like to begin? I see someone right here. Would you please have the microphone because we're recording this? And tell us who you are, please.
I'm Jakob Rigi, and I'm teaching here, and I'm from Iran. So I have a question for Evgeny. Actually, what's happening today in Iran? So they actually control the whole press. But any event which happened in Iran actually is publicized. And it's publicized to the internet. People have blogs outside the country, and they publish it, and actually they use proxies in Iran, okay, to read them. So my question is this: internet is like a sea, yeah? Like a seas. Of course, pirates or states, they can actually block, but anyway, if they block, actually, then they disconnect themselves, you know. So Iran want to have it in a national internet. In that sense, this is unprecedented in the whole Iranian history. Shah actually could completely block, any kind of circulation of news. But today there is any significant news which is not publicized, in spite of the cyber army that the regime has built. Thanks.
Sure. Well, should we take more questions or one by one?
No, go ahead.
Again, look, there is no denying that the internet has been transformational. And here I'm guilty of talking about the internet with a capital I, which I just banned, but let's stick to that. Again, the big question is whether governments will figure out a way in which to co-opt it to their other projects, goals, and agendas. And many of those governments, even before the internet came around, were already struggling with the projects of globalization and modernity, and were transforming themselves to make themselves more flexible and more responsive to public opinion. In China, the government has been trying to become more accommodating to public opinion before the internet. And it happened that the internet facilitated some of that, and who knows how China would survive that challenge. The point here is that, of course, these regimes are changing in response. Some of the change is willing, some of the change is unwilling. The question for people who are concerned with questions of open society and democracy, I think, is what are the ways in which we can thwart their efforts to co-opt the internet. And some of it may be that we need to ban, for example, as I said, Western companies from selling spying technology to these companies. Some of it, these governments, some of it may be in training more activists, as Ahmad was saying. Some of it may be in making sure that Facebooks and Googles and Twitters of this world behave responsibly when it comes to hosting such content. There are all sorts of questions, but I think the basic point of denying the existence or the significance of the internet, I think we are past that point in the debate. So there isn't, and I'll take 1 minute for self-promotion. The reason why my book is called The Net Delusion is not because I criticize people who think that the internet matters. It's that I criticize people who think about the internet in ways that I find very shallow and disconnected from reality. So I'm not arguing that the internet doesn't matter. I'm just arguing that the way in which we have made sense of it so far is harmful when it comes to formulating policies and when it comes to formulating foreign policy especially.
Okay, we had somebody back here. And then,
Hi, I have a question for Evgeny.
Say
I'm
who you are.
Fuad Khan from Environmental Sciences and Policy. You said that technology in itself is not necessarily good or bad, but just looking at history,
I
I
didn't
think
say that, by the way, but that's fine.
that's kind of the impression that I got. That you don't want to say technology T with a capital T. But I mean, just looking at history, aren't there some technologies, especially information dissemination technologies, such as the printing press or the invention of the written word, which can said to have actually had a positive impact on the human project? And don't you think that in the light of that observation, that the criticism that that there are problems with the internet it's kind of trivial?
Well, I mean, everything is trivial if you take a very cosmic perspective, which I'm not inclined to today. But I think much of the difficulty in grasping this argument that I've been trying to make comes from just the poverty of the English language, where there is just one word for technology. In European languages like German or French, you have terms like technique and technology, where you can actually operate with the capital T technology and still operate with smaller level technologies, right? So, and that's actually a well-recognized point in intellectual history. Something went wrong in the early 20th century when some American intellectuals started embracing some of the themes and thinking about technology from Germany and couldn't distinguish between technique and technology. That aside, what I want to say is that, of course, there are lots of technologies that have had a positive impact, and there are lots of them that have had a negative impact. What I'm rejecting is trying to sum up those impacts and come up with some thesis of whether technology is helping democracy, whether it's hurting democracy, because ultimately I don't think that thesis is going to help us to regulate those technologies or to think about the consequences.
Ahmad wanted to
Yeah,
say.
since no one wants to ask me any questions, I want to say that
There are many hands up.
governments are all technologies themselves. They've been invented. The machine of government has been invented, improved, enhanced, fixed, refurbished, and now it's smoking again. So what has been impressive for me, as someone who's been involved with open source projects and working with people I've never met, is the new forms of organization that can take place simply because there is communications that are efficient. What I studied also in management and organization, there has been this spectrum of centralization and decentralization, and the more efficient the communication channels are, the more autonomous and independent the organization can become without losing much of the benefits of centralization. Which is quick correspondence and messaging. So the internet has not only been the medium, but it is showing us new ways to deal with each other and communicate and organize ourselves. So, and somehow this is another form of how transforming it is, in addition to what Evgeny has been saying.
Young me, did you want to say something?
Young Mi Kim from Public Policy. I actually work on internet activity, and once I defined it as digital populism. And I'm very impressed by this internet activism, what's happening with the Arab Spring. But I also witnessed worrying implication of this internet activity. If we see numbers of blogs or internet discussion or comments, many comments behind hidden identity are very vulgar, vicious, or cruel.
Yeah.
At the same time, there are lots of unverified truth or claims or unmediated thoughts are uploaded every second. So I have a question whether this should be censored or we should have kind of a campaign to have nice internet culture.
Okay. This is for me? A question for me?
Yeah, Ahmad, you try.
Okay.
You can answer it too.
No, I'll let him handle it.
Ahmad.
Okay.
You take the easy ones.
As a principle, I'm against censoring because what's verified information? State television, state press, Fox News. I mean, what is verified information and right information? You can never have this unless you work your mind on what you're receiving, and eventually there is no authority but what you can reach with your peers and with your mind. So I cannot say that censorship is good in any way. I've seen the bad examples of people's ability to be mischievous and evil on the internet. My friend who was attacked and targeted, and before him others were so attacked and singled out because someone, as we say, targeted them and put them in their minds to make him under scrutiny and incite the authority, whether it be government or army or with whoever, or even the public, the mob, against them. So it's bad use and it's really harmful. But still, you cannot. There is no way that you can single this out without sacrificing much of the other good uses of the internet and the flow of information.
Different countries have different regimes. Sweden would censor and the US would not. But it's a whole area of study and worthy of our attention. And I want to put in a plug for media literacy training at a young age. And this is one of my great passions. And it goes along with civics learning, because citizenship in a democracy is an active obligation rather than a passive entertainment. But that's for another day. We have many hands up. I have one right down here.
Well, that's for you, Ahmed. So this question, you're speaking.
Tell who you are.
Oh, sorry. My name is Nadia Baghdadi. I'm from the history department. The question about implications for democracy and civil society. Now, when you speak about the social networks and the nets that you are forming, there is, of course, when we speak of Egypt, an enormous net that is not included in this because they don't have access to the net. How did this play out in the Egyptian upspring, that you have this division of those who can communicate and the large numbers of those who don't have access? I mean, what kind of hierarchy or flow of information do you have there internally? And does this have any further repercussion? Because this is now quite a while ago that we had the upspring. How that has, I don't know, been built in the in-groups and out-groups?
Okay. First, the internet doesn't have to be a first source for everyone. It can be a second source. Behind every young man or woman who uses the internet, there is a family who do actually get information and news and opinions through them, which has been the case also with literacy. If you can read, you don't only read for yourself, you read for your family and your village sometimes. But in Egypt, I'm not sure this was true, because most of the people young people in Egypt, where internet is cheap, are using the internet. We've had more than 20 million users of the internet, not subscribers, because a portion of that is what companies like to call illegal use or piracy. But eventually, a large percentage of youth who are, or should be, the determinants of how a society should go, are in fact users of the internet. The rest are either too small or too big, and they are either insignificant or anti-revolutionary anyway, so they don't matter. We don't want them. But the significant chunk, active, alive part of society is mostly on the internet. 1 million people have joined Facebook, mostly of the outside of this class strata after the revolution. Mostly older people who didn't believe in the importance of the medium before, but after seeing it in action, they want to know what their children and their younger relatives are doing. Another factor is that can you say what? Can you remind me again of the last part of your question?
No, whether this then, I mean, if you say in any case there was no great distinction. My
My question was if I assumed that there was, right, and that the
Yeah.
figures are actually quite substantial, that this would also have repercussions of how then the formation of the groups that are now leading or wanting to get into power.
Yeah, well, there was a third point, but I forgot it for now, so maybe
You'll get it
I'll
back
add it later, yeah.
In the meantime, Victor wanted to say something.
Yes, I'm Viktor Oshatinsky from Legal Studies. You see, in the 20th century when I lived, we had these organizations. I'm talking because it took me a good year till today even to accept online evaluations. So I'm really very far backward in the technology. But we had monitoring organizations and watchdog organizations. They were primarily necessary for democracy to watch what governments are doing, including when governments are lying. Actually, my attempt to move into 21st century, you pushed me back when I read something by you showing how many blogs and bloggers and internet entries are paid for by the governments to cheat and to mislead us and actually are supported by them. And now there is a question that was raised here, can we perhaps monitor and can we press the factories and corporations and technological developments from selling these newest tools of surveillance control to the governments? My question is it technically possible? And how much would it cost to have social surveillance over what government is doing, both with misleading people through information, and second also by using technologies that may be extremely sensitive and extremely secret that will increase surveillance, etc., etc. I think this is would be very important, but probably impossible or too expensive. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'll try to take that. The very short and simple answer, and probably very unsatisfying one, is that we only have glimpses of data and evidence of what governments are doing in this space, and we only get to watch them when they screw up, more or less. So you may have followed, there was a big case in Germany a few weeks ago when it was discovered that the German secret police was installing spyware, special software on computers of suspects, and it was done with some constitutional violations, but it was also the kind of spyware that would allow the police to actually add any evidence that did not exist on the suspect's computers, thus essentially raising all sorts of questions about whether it will be admissible in court, but also raising all sorts of questions about whether criminals and other non-state actors would actually be able to use the same spyware to watch the citizens, because it was done in a very unprofessional manner. So, and we can only guess what's happening in the United States, where NSA has been at the cutting edge of research into these technologies. The point about limiting the export of such tools to authoritarian states is extremely important, and there is a growing debate about this issue. And right now, much of this debate revolves around the question of whether technology companies actually know that their tools are being used in Syria or elsewhere. It turned out that the hardware that the Syrian government was using to spy on its citizens was originally shipped by the US government to Iraq. And somehow from Iraq, it made its way to Syria. And even though we know that the company that manufactured that hardware was aware that this technology was being used in Syria, which is, by the way, in violation of the US sanctions on doing business with Syria, that technology didn't do anything. That company didn't do anything. The question then becomes, should we be forcing companies that build such technologies that end up on secondary market anyway? Whether we should be forcing them to build, let's say, kill switches in those tools, so that once they discover that they're being used in Syria, they would be able to turn off those switches. Well, there are all sorts of additional questions on top of this, because if you start building kill switches in those technologies, then again, other non-state actors and criminals would be able to use those kill switches even if they're used in America or elsewhere, because all of these devices are standardized. So there is a question of standards. I mean, that's the best case study for globalization in action. But so far, there are some efforts by the European Parliament and others to do something, but the situation is just so complex technologically, not to mention policy-wise, that not much progress has been made. So only shaming these companies will probably do the job, and some companies have stopped actually supplying those tools after they have been shamed. Policy-wise, I don't see much progress, unfortunately.
I have seen 5, 6 hands up. We have 5 minutes. So I think we should take at least 3 of these questions in a row, and then we have to try to remember what they are and answer them. So we'll take your question, and then your question, and then your question, and we'll answer them after we hear the questions.
Okay, my question is very short, it's for Evgeny. We are talking about companies, and I might wonder that if we don't take into account countries like China or Russia about this government censorship, if you think that now the biggest problem is around net neutrality and that how big telecommunication companies can control internet, and if you think that this is a big problem, and how can you protect net neutrality?
Okay, that's one question, and then we have 2 in this area right here. Down here, please. Right here in the white? Yeah. Gray.
Thanks to both our speakers. My name is Stanislav. I'm a student here from Russia. My question, I guess, is more to Evgeny. Here in this room today, we basically spoke or implied 2 groups of people, us as a society, as a people, as a users, which are the forces of good, and then there's a state, the force of ultimate evil.
Certain states, yes.
Yeah. And my question is, there are, other groups which weren't mentioned, which are, at least in my opinion, much worse than some states, even authoritarian states. For instance, not being a fan of current Russian regime at all, I do recognize that there are certain groups which are much worse. The extreme nationalists, there's a huge Islam fundamentalist problem. And I know you don't like this word, but essentially we do want the state to protect us as citizens, and that's why we pay taxes. So in a way, we do want them to be as technologically advanced as possible. And where and how do we draw this line? Because we do want them to be one step ahead of those kind of the bad guys.
Sure.
And then Peter.
Peter Molnar, CEU. Can you build on some parts of your traditions in Egypt or Belarus that support freedom of speech as a traditional value in your society that can be exercised more powerfully through new social media?
We have time for Kate. Kate?
I guess it's maybe a natural extension of some of this. My one concern in this discussion, Kate Coyer, Center for Media and Communication Studies, is that I fully agree with everything that's been said, but I want to ask if you can, if you agree with this, help those of us in the audience that might not be involved in revolutionary activities or on the frontline activism, how this discussion and how the role of corporate intermediaries and state policies impact us in our everyday practice.
Okay, I think 4 questions is all we can handle right now.
Yeah.
Who would like to begin?
I'll begin with the question about traditional media, about traditional culture. Culture has everything. It talks about the virtues of speaking the truth in the presence of a tyrant as the ultimate courage, and it also speaks about the virtues of being smart and sly and not throw yourself to the monster or whatever. So yes, you can find whatever you want in culture. You can promote it. You can pick and choose and emphasize certain messages. But it's the story of humanity. So, I'm not sure if you can say something that will shut the way on those who can claim otherwise. But also by using the same culture, religion, for example, is full of the thing, and it's opposite according to how you interpret. So, yes, you can find whatever you want. If this is an answer.
All right, so I'll try to take 3 questions and they're quick. Net neutrality. On this, I'd like to say that part of my overall project has been trying to show connections between the debate on domestic internet policy in the West and Western Europe and the US and the implications of this for foreign policy in places like China and Iran. One thing I'd like to say on net neutrality, which most people and most senators and policymakers say in Washington don't realize, is that if the current consensus on net neutrality falls, and if we end up with more ISPs and more service providers monitoring users' traffic will also end up with more tools for monitoring, right? And of course, those tools will be used and deployed in a rather democratic fashion in the West with court orders and whatnot, and they will be used primarily to crack down on piracy, right? To crack down on illegal entertainment or to discriminate between different kinds of content and thus charge more. But all of those tools will end up on the secondary market, and that secondary market will be in authoritarian states. So if you are, as a policymaker, seriously opposing net neutrality, but at the same time promoting the power of the internet to liberate China or Iran, you've got a rhetorical problem. Right, and that's something that most policymakers haven't yet grasped. The other point on extreme nationalists and non-state actors, I actually fully agree with you. I do think that most people in the West, when they think about places like Russia or China, fail to grasp that many of those governments are genuinely, I don't want to say popular, but they are accepted in part because they are there to deal with a lot of nasty stuff that's happening in those countries otherwise. And that a lot of nasty stuff is also happening in cyberspace. And the American government, for example, has been quite assertive in cyberspace in dealing with all sorts of issues, from cybercrime to cyber war to child pornography to whatnot. And the question then becomes, how do we square the rhetoric of internet freedom and making sure that the internet is China or Russia is free as possible with the general recognition that some of the work that these governments do does defend citizens and does defend their privacy and does defend their rights? And that's a question that we can't even square in the West. There is no answer that an American senator or policymaker would give you if you ask him, well, why do you defend internet freedom in China, but in the United States you want to crack down on internet piracy or on cybercrime or on anonymity because you fear cybercrime or cyber war? I mean, they have no good answers. And on the question of what can ordinary citizens do, I think here my big soundbite, and I only have time for soundbite, is there are two visions for the internet right now. It can either become a paradise for consumers or a hell for citizens, and they're not mutually exclusive. And companies, of course, Facebooks and Googles of this world want to make it a paradise for consumers. You know, everything you've bought will determine all the offers you'll receive in the next 5 years. You'll get all the advertising based on what your friends have browsed and visited in the past. All of that is more or less what's happening to the internet. All, of course, is also facilitated by huge surveillance infrastructure and by all sorts of developments that make an internet a place that is not particularly conducive to democratic debate or citizens who are free to express dissent and then not to be prosecuted for it by either the employers or all sorts of other powerful actors. So making sure that we keep those two visions, you know, the utopian and the dystopian one in mind, the hell for citizens and a paradise for consumers, and making sure that we actually reverse the terms would not be a bad goal to strive towards.
I'm afraid that's our final word. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.